So when people ever say, what's the definition between primitive and traditional archery and where you draw the line, I don't think anybody's ever had a solid answer. But if I had to really give you an answer now, it would be, hi guys, Ryan Gill here with Hunt Primitive, where we entertain, educate, and inspire. And I'm in the shop desk right now and wanted to answer a couple questions, say like on a magic formula, right? So I hear people ask questions. I do have, in the last video, one of the last videos that I did, I gave a link to the directory, the Hunt Primitive directory of all, so many questions can be answered through all my different videos. But I already know that when you watch YouTube and videos are scattered everywhere, they're very hard to just pick and choose and say, where do I find that video? That's what the directory is for. It's completely free, and I'll drop a link down in the description. And all it is if you have questions on arrows, you go to the arrows section. If you have questions on atlatls, you go to the atlatls section. But I got hit with another question. It's not the first time that I've had this question roll through, and it's, well, what's the formula for this? Or how do you do this? Or does this matter? So the specific question was, and I've already done a video on this, is does arrow spine matter at a certain distance? And the answer is yes, and the answer is also no. It's because there's different variables. The important things, I think, to really understand, when you're talking primitive archery, there's no formula, there's no set standard. So when people ever say, what's the definition between primitive and traditional archery and where you draw the line, I don't think anybody's ever had a solid answer. But if I had to really give you an answer now, it would be go to, if you do this, 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 and this, you're going to have the results you're looking for. Where primitive archery is, some of our variables can be skewed, some of them can be totally different, and it's about improvising and making it work. I think that's a great explanation between primitive archery and traditional archery. Now, all that being said, saying something along the lines of, does arrow spine matter? I did a video on that. One of the favorite things that I did in that, and it reaffirms what I just said about traditional archery and primitive archery, is Clay Hayes, who I've hung out with, hunted with, talked to. He did a video basically saying yes, it does matter. I did a video saying no, it doesn't matter, and it's such a great point, because in traditional archery, especially, which I think is more Clay's threshold within itself is traditional, where I'm more of the improvisation of primitive archery, it doesn't necessarily matter. It does, but it doesn't. The important factor, no matter which side you take, is, say, arrow flight. That the arrow must get there straight. That's the end goal. But in some circumstances, say we could build a bow by aligning the string off to one side, making the bow essentially more center shot, maybe potentially shooting longer arrows, shooting a different spine of arrow, say a very light spine arrow with no point, or simply a very long arrow, even if it's heavy spined with a light point. There's a lot of different variables. Well, that's very primitive archery-esque, to be able to say, well, we're changing variables and we're improvising, where traditional archery is, well, your arrows need to be this length, they need to be this spine, they need to have this grain on the front, because that's a set standard. And if you shoot this off of this specific bow that's built this far off center, they should shoot perfect in theory. And that's, I do love the differences. And of course I am very much the improvisation primitive archery type, where I say, hey, I can literally take a bow, because I've done this so many times over without even knowing. When I lived in Montana, I did not own a spine tester. I didn't even make arrows for sale, but I made all my own arrows, had no idea what they spined. And I shot a lot of deer with arrows that were like big, like thick, because I was so worried about being underspined and then breaking, because you hear stories about that. So I just made arrows and I kind of sized them up. And a lot of times I came back, like when I moved back to Florida and I got more professional, I bought a spine tester. I still had those arrows. I put them on a spine tester, and they would be 80 to 120 spine, but they flew so good off of my bows. And I was like, well, arrow spine doesn't matter at all. But then I could build a bow, and then also a 58 spine wouldn't shoot off of it, but a 62 spine would shoot perfect. So it's like mind-blowing. What you start figuring out is, especially in primitive archery, if you're building a bow and you set the string off to the side, that's one of the little things that I mentioned in that other video on arrow spine is it can make your bow less picky with arrow spine. But the end goal is to have the arrows fly perfectly straight. So if somebody says, hey, does arrow spine matter in the first 5 yards? Well, of course it does. It matters at the first 5 yards the same as it does at 20 yards, except at 20 yards, you do actually have time for your fleshings to overcorrect and then straighten that arrow out, where at 5 yards, maybe you don't. But if your bow's not spine picky, you could have arrows that come off perfectly straight at 5 yards and perfectly straight at 20 yards. But also, even if you're at 20 yards and you shoot and your arrow has to overcorrect, well then obviously that's not going to do very well at close range. But also, every time it overcorrects, you're losing energy. So there's no specific formula, okay, when you're talking primitive archery. Traditional archery, there's a lot of data. I think a ton of people have data on you need to have this, and it'll work. And oftentimes, like your FOC and your certain distances off of center, all these things are variables that you can control that actually make it easier to achieve that straight arrow flight. So especially something like FOC. So of course we know that penetrates better, and we know that you're going to get better arrow flight because of that. But if we're talking in a primitive context where you can't necessarily shoot a big giant honking stone point on there, nor did primitive people do that on arrows, it no longer is comparable. We can't use the formula, the traditional archery formula, in primitive archery and have it be in context or even work. If we're talking about shooting stone points or even cane arrows, saying something that's tapered from the nock and it gets wider as it goes, so you're talking about a variable spine on an arrow shaft compared to a parallel shaft cut out of cedar or fir or something. Two totally different animals. So the important part, I started to do a video on this a while back, and I decided not to do it because it just wasn't coming across great. And now is a perfect time to bring it up. People ask me questions, and they say, how do you do this? And I say, I have a video on it. Go watch the video. The information's there. And sometimes people will come back to me and say, I tried it once. It didn't work. I need, how does this work? It doesn't work. What you said doesn't work. And sometimes you have to try. You have to put a little bit of this into the play, and you have to try more. You can't just say it didn't work once, because what you're assuming is I told you, you're trying to go off the variable, because I told you, well, if you do this and this and this, it'll fly. And I say, you don't need a specific arrow spine if your bow's like this. Well, you shoot it and it doesn't work one time, and you say, well, this doesn't work. What you're misunderstanding is there are exceptions to the rule, and you're going to have to put in a little bit of legwork yourself to figure it out. That is specifically why traditional archery, the genre, is much larger than primitive archery. Because in traditional archery, we can go by the book and say, this works, this works, this works, and this works. And give that to somebody, and it makes it work. Primitive archery is one of those things where it can be very difficult, but it can also be very, very basic. It could be the simplest thing ever, or it could be incredibly complex. It just depends on the direction you decide to go with it. If you try to overcomplicate primitive archery, it's like you're going to fight it every step of the way. Does that make sense? So sometimes you have to stop thinking so hard, try a couple things. Especially when you do say, I have a bow, and I have I shoot this arrow off of it and it shoots well, but if I shoot this one, it doesn't. But this one should work. Well, of course it should work by traditional archery standards, but it doesn't by primitive archery because of all the other arrow variables, be it a tapered shaft or a light point on the front, or who knows what, all the distance off center that the bow is built. There's got to be some improvisation in there, and you almost have to help yourself a little bit. So I can give you all these videos I have in this directory, lean back into, here's how you do this. This is how I do this, and this works. It works, it works, it works, it works, or it doesn't work, it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And I can tell you that, but I can't physically grab your stuff and say, hey, let me shoot it, and I can tell you immediately what's going wrong, because primitive archery requires improvisation. And if you don't want to do the improvisation, you have two choices. Go back to traditional archery, where you can follow step-by-step rules, or work through somebody like me that sees it on a day-to-day basis, and I know what to expect. And so when you say I have this poundage of bow and I want to shoot this, I can just make you arrows that are going to fly good. Or if you say, hey, I'm shooting this kind of bow and I just want it to be able to hunt deer, and I want to be able to shoot this arrow and this arrow off at the same time, I can work with that. So when you tell stuff like when you order a primitive bow and you tell me things like that, I can say, I got you. And I can put a little bit of work into it. I can kind of tailor fit bows between poundage and build design to make all that work, because this is my life. I have a lot of accumulated time into building all of these different components, so I kind of have this intuitive nature about me that I just know that these arrows should fly really good, or these ones are probably not going to do good for you. But at the end of the day, again, if you're looking that you want to have all the answers you're looking for, then you need to go with the traditional archery. If you enjoy trying to figure things out for yourself, primitive archery is perfect. And if you want to go primitive, but you don't want to have to figure everything out for yourself, that's when you call a guy like me and say, I need this and this and this. Hey, I have one of your bows, but I'm making the arrows. I hear this fairly often. I used to. I kind of curved that now. Used to be I would make a bow for somebody, and they're like, well, I want to build the arrows myself. And nowadays I basically tell them, hey man, the arrows are actually a lot more difficult than the bow itself is, and more often than not. So it's like you'd be better off building the bow yourself and then getting arrows done professionally, because arrows are actually a lot more difficult. Even though they're smaller and they don't take as much time, getting a matched set of arrows is actually more difficult than getting a good bow. So, but now if you have a good bow matched with good arrows, you've got something that you can just annihilate every shot that you take. You can take down animals all the time. You can be very consistent, but it's hard to do both until you've built X amount of bows and X amount of arrows, and then see how they work together. So when somebody says, hey, I'm going to buy a bow from you because I love your bows, but I'm going to build my own arrows, I pretty much already know in my head that you're going to call me in about a week and tell me that the bow doesn't shoot right because your arrows don't group, and you think that they just should. And I'm like, and I've, like I said, I don't have to deal with this too much because I curve this now and basically show people. I've sent people arrows and say, shoot this set of arrows with the bow and you're going to see now it works, right? So as much as you hate to hear it, your arrows are not very well matched with each other, or they're just, it takes so much work to do it. And I hate to insult people and be like, hey man, the bow works, just send the bow back, I'll do a video and I'll put arrows in straight perfect every single time. Your arrows suck. And that's unfortunate, but that's the truth of it. And I would rather be honest with people about it. Now, so when it comes to, is there a magic formula in primitive archery? Can you use engineering's standards? What diameter, what spine, if I'm going to use calipers on building my bow, it just doesn't work like that. Primitive archery is so off the wall different when it comes to improvisation. You have to be able to just simply go with the flow and say, hey, this doesn't work, but I look at the numbers or I look at the books in traditional archery and it says that it should work. Well, just accept the fact this don't work with your setup. So change it, find what does work, and then use it, even if it doesn't make sense by the standards. Hopefully that makes sense. So is there a magic formula to make all of this work? Absolutely not. If you want the magic formula, either go traditional or go with a guy like me that has a lot of experience. But the number one thing that you need to take from all of this, if you are into primitive archery, any sort of primitive skills whatsoever, is you have to try and try and try some more, and it's trial and error. You have to figure some of it out. It can be super easy, but it can also be incredibly difficult. And sometimes you have to stop overthinking it and just try different things, trial and error, see what works, see what doesn't work, and then go with that direction. So hey, thanks for following along, and we'll catch you on the next adventure.